Dear viewers, subscribe to the channel and put a like on the video, so YouTube can recommend you new stories and new chapters. If anything, you can always remove the like if you don't like the story. Thank you for your support, and here we go. Secrets of the Library. Chapter 1. Rose walked up the library's central staircase, carrying dusty tomes in her hands. She and Lily were the crypt girls, sorting and rearranging books in the main stacks in the basements. Rose was sometimes assigned to help people in the public research rooms, and Lily usually stayed in the stacks downstairs in the crypt. The pay wasn't great, but thanks to the fact that both she and Lily earned small salaries as assistant librarians, they managed to keep their rent down and live, albeit sometimes meagerly. They graduated from St. Tristan's after living together for 4 years, and became much closer than they would have guessed. Shortly after graduation, Lily got a job at a library in St. Louis, and then sent Rose a letter asking if she wanted to work at the library. Rose was overjoyed. Her mother had been pressuring her to consider marriage to a suitably wealthy man. Perhaps anticipating the kind of relationship Lily and herself would enter into, her mother didn't seem to care much about who she married. Rose happily moved in with Lily, and they easily resumed their relationship, a very easy Boston marriage. Once in a while, they accepted an invitation for a double date to a club or a dance, but neither she nor Lily had any real desire to start a serious long-term relationship with a man. They'd both tried it, and they'd had fun, but they'd found each other much better company. Even if they were inclined, dating men was problematic. The library had a morals clause, though it wasn't as strict and serious as some of the ones she'd seen. A casual date would be acceptable, but any hint of actual inappropriateness or even a long-term relationship could cost them their jobs. The public library's research room was usually empty during the day, except for the quiet man, Ken Stanton, who did research on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, practically from opening to closing. Rose figured he must be a professor or perhaps a writer, though his broad shoulders seemed more like they were designed for a longshoreman's job. The conservatively dressed man was always focused on his extensive research, but invariably polite and aloofly friendly with Rose, who usually searched the bizarre variety of obscure texts on his behalf herself. He usually wore a handsome linen suit, occasionally removing his jacket while he sorted out the books in the crypt. Invariably, he quietly asked her permission to remove his jacket, and it wasn't a courtesy. She got the feeling he was genuinely concerned that he might offend her. She considered him a trustworthy assistant, and truth be told, a pleasant distraction. He was certainly better than the standard set of frat boys who were constantly propositioning her, and he certainly had much better manners. He'd been coming here before Lily started working in the library, and knew the collections well. There was a jagged scar running down the left side of his face. Lily had disrespectfully insisted it was a dueling scar, but Rose suspected it was more serious than that, for his hands were also badly scratched. Perhaps, she pondered, they were the remnants of a hard early life, or, she supposed, he was of an age where he might well have served in the war. On someone else, those scars might have looked menacing, but he was so quiet and unassuming that they made no impression, at least on her. However, his rather broad and muscular shoulders caught her attention, though not in a negative way. Lily had teased him, saying that she dreamed of being transported on his shoulders, and perhaps she was, just a little bit. Of course, Lily didn't seem too discouraged by such a prospect herself. She noted that he had 2 shoulders, after all, well suited for transporting fair maidens. Today, Mr. Stanton was already in a shirt and linen vest. It was hotter than usual, even for mid-August, and although the high ceilings and ceiling fans helped a lot, the heat was felt everywhere. The man seemed focused on the limestone caves that dotted the landscape of central Missouri. Rose had brought a dozen books, from geology textbooks to land grants, as well as recent newspapers from the area. She moved the last of the books to the table beside him. He looked up at her. "Did you manage to find them all?" She smiled. "That's it, although there were 2 different volumes of land grants covering the time period you're considering, so I brought both." For a few seconds, his gaze focused on her. "Oh? Thanks, Rose. That'll save time." Absently, he added, "I don't think I'll need anything else for a couple hours, so you can retire to the crypt. It's much cooler there." You don't want to leave beautiful flowers withering in the heat." He said it in a tone that was more of a statement of fact than anything else. Rose blushed, thanked him, and headed back to the crypt, first informing Mrs. Crenshaw of her whereabouts, and then going downstairs to help Lily. As it turned out, Lily was as deep in the crypt as you could get, in the third basement, where the walls were carved out of living limestone. Lily worked near the Forbidden Stacks, an area closed to all but a few employees. The Forbidden Zone held rare and expensive books, city archives, and books that could be deemed morally degrading. If a book from this zone was requested, Mrs. Crenshaw had to get approval from at least 2 members of the library board, and then, if the request was approved, the reader had to do his or her research in this area in the constant presence of a library assistant. Lily was carefully shelving books from her huge wooden cart, but as soon as she saw that Rose was alone, she stopped and lowered herself to a vacant spot on the cart, leaning against the shelves. "Have a seat, Rosa," she gestured to another, noticeably empty seat on the cart. Lily had an excellent memory, so she could put away books many times faster than the next fastest attendant, which she sometimes took advantage of by getting far ahead of herself, and then sitting and reading for long periods of time. And still she managed to get more work done in the crypt than anyone else. Mrs. Crenshaw, of course, was aware of Lily's long interruptions, but paid no attention to it, for the work was done. Besides, Lily could be a distraction if she was in public places. Lily's tall, lean figure and blonde hair were just as notable as Rose's curly red locks and shorter, fuller figure. But Lily lacked Rose's ability to avoid confrontation. More than one frat boy had received a ringing slap before Lily had been sentenced to confinement in the crypt. Rose took her sweater from the cart, put it on, and climbed onto the cart next to Lily. Lily smiled and raised one eyebrow. "So how's our man?" Rose told her about his remark about flowers and wilting. Lily chuckled. "Do you think he'll want to come down here and do some gardening?" For the next hour, they shelved several books, and Lily quietly kept up an endless stream of witty chatter, full of hints about gardening. She was particularly interested in plowing and fertilizing. They were both in a rather silly mood when they heard a heavy door at the top of the stairs. Footsteps sounded. Someone was coming down from the second cellar. To Rose's surprise, Mrs. Crenshaw appeared from around the corner, leading Ken Stanton behind her and carrying a heavy ring of keys. He put his jacket back on, which Rose thought would disappoint Lily, but it was quite cool in the lower crypt. "Rose, Lily, Mr. Stanton requires access to the restricted stack. So, given that we don't have a male assistant today, I'm going to ask you both to stay put. In any case, there are books in the restricted stack that need to be rearranged." Rose was puzzled, as any book taken from restricted access was always immediately shelved. However, after she let them inside, Rose saw a large stack of volumes next to one of the large chairs in the research area in the center. Obviously, not everything had been put in place. As they checked in, she noticed that the previous research record had been signed by Mrs. Garrison, the wife of the library board president. The entry read, "Miscellaneous." Mrs. Crenshaw handed Rose a card listing the materials allowed and hurried out, leaving Lily and Rose to exchange perplexed glances. Rose gestured to the chairs and tables. "Please, Mr. Stanton, have a seat, and I'll find those records for you." He smiled pleasantly and sat down in a large green chair with a rather large table in front of him. "Thanks, Rose. I'm researching old land records and maps, so a big desk is probably for the best." She saw past him as Lily made her way to the large stack of unopened books Mrs. Harrison had left behind, paused, arched her eyebrows, and said quietly, "Rose?" She returned her attention to Ken, Mr. Stanton, and nodded. "I'll be back." The reviews and maps were lying side by side, so it was easy to compare them. When she returned, Ken was sitting in his chair writing in his notebooks, and Lily was sorting through the unopened books. As she laid out the maps and surveys, Lily didn't move. She seemed frozen, staring at the open book in her hand. Rose walked over to her and saw that Lily's face was flushed. "Are you okay?" she hissed. Lily shook her head for a second. I just... Her voice broke. Rose had never seen Lily in such a state before. She reached out to take the book from her, but it fell out of Lily's obviously nervous fingers and slid straight to Ken's foot. When he reached down and picked up the book, Lily's flushed face paled and took on an expression of absolute horror. Rose turned and took a step toward him, glaring at Lily. Ken opened the cover, glanced at the ex libris, and grinning slightly, held the book out to her. As a rule, no, I can assume Lily is used to sorting. Rose snatched the book out of his hands and opened it to see what was happening. She almost dropped the book. Rose was hardly inexperienced, but the stunningly graphic illustrations of people, apparently from India, engaged in a rather complicated and very acrobatic sexual encounter almost made her drop the book too. Oh. Good God. She stopped, blushing from head to toe, and looked at Ken, noticing the amusement in his eyes. He interrupted the awkward moment as smoothly as possible. This is the Kama Sutra. Technically, it's a tantric religious text, though that's not usually the reason copies are brought here from India. The binding looks new, but the sheets, judging by the paper, are likely imported from India. They may have been cut from a series of scrolls. This is an extremely valuable work. Libraries are supposed to hold all sorts of materials, Rose. That's what they're for. You and Lily are hardly responsible for Mrs. Garrison's selection of research materials. Lily looked at the stack. There were a few more books there, and began to look through them, placing each one carefully on the table. She was naturally shy. Despite her overtly cheeky demeanor, her cheeky jokes and comments were a shield of sorts. I think they're all like this. She picked up one with an ornate varnished wood cover and looked at the bindings. These books aren't categorized by subject like the others. They're categorized by country of origin and then by subject. And the subjects are all different. Ken nodded absent-mindedly. Since you're holding a Japanese marriage manual or pillow book in your hands, it makes sense. An Indian book is theology. A Japanese book would be considered a textbook. An Arabic book, if you have one, would be anatomy or physiology. And a British Pearl magazine would be fiction. He seemed immersed in the study of a particular map. Rose decided to help Lily put the volumes on the shelf while he continued his research. It turned out to be a rather slow process, one that wasn't really sped up by Lily's insistence that she point out our particularly interesting illustrations. Or, to be honest, her own interest in those illustrations. Lily was terrible. She kept showing Rose the most salacious illustrations, especially the ones showing 2 women and 1 man, making tender eyes, fluttering her eyelashes, and asking if she thought they could find a man who might be able to help them with this complex and fascinating subject, all the while looking toward the reading room and winking. When Rose threatened to tie her up to make her behave, Lily only said, "Great Britain, aisle 2, aisle 3, the whole shelf." And that turned out to be correct. She obligingly suggested that the sticks and spankings were on the 4th shelf, and on the 5th. Ken seemed oblivious to their quiet conversations, for which Rose was grateful. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had become congenial, though not so too familiar that Mrs. Crenshaw had anything to complain about, and they learned that the reason for Ken's familiarity was that in his youth he had worked in a library not unlike this one. What he was doing now, though, remained unclear. Unlike most men, he didn't press for forced familiarity. This seemed to disappoint Lily a little, though it was a relief to Rose. She loved working in the library, and she really didn't want to be out of a job. When Mrs. Crenshaw quietly peeked into the library, probably wanting to see what they were doing, she found them rearranging the cards, as Lily had noticed that many of them were misplaced. After Ken finished his research and said he would return the next day with the tracing paper, he left and Mrs. Crenshaw returned to lock the iron grate and let them out the back door closest to their apartment building. On the way home, Lily and Rose stopped by the Blue Star Tea Room for a quick snack before heading home. As soon as Rose locked the door, she felt Lily's arms around her. "I've been starving for you all day." Rose turned and kissed her, and then, while Lily struggled with her clothes, said, "Me too. I can't believe you were so bad in there." Rose had planned to do some reading earlier in the day, but that was not going to happen today. Looking at outspoken books from 10 countries had left both her and Lily with some new creative ideas. Ken Stanton entered the lavishly furnished restaurant with his hands in plain view and lowered himself into the chair that Giovanni Johnny Gambini had gestured to. Johnny's son Vittorio, or Vic, sat to his left with barely concealed contempt. Ken accepted a glass of red wine from the waiter with a concerned look. Vic looked directly at his father. "Dad, look, I told you I could handle it. It's those green boys again. A good thrashing and they'll back off." Johnny looked at Ken. "Please forgive my son's lack of manners. He tries, but his mom spoils him too much." Ken smiled, the smooth, humorless smile of a true predator, though Vic didn't recognize it. Ken could feel the 4 nervous bodyguards adjusting their distance. They didn't care about people Vic didn't know. "Sir, I think I understand your son's hesitancy to enlist outside help. Being cautious of outsiders is a kind of wisdom." Johnny smiled, recognizing the subtle attempt at politeness. Still, the police are paying too much attention to this case, and something about it smells rotten. "My guys are loyal, experienced, and well-meaning, but I'd rather have a professional handle this place." At those words, Johnny threw a glare at Vic, not too delicately suggesting he shut up. Ken pretended not to notice anything. "I'll do it for the price offered, but I need a reliable delivery truck, nothing new. I think an old grocery truck would work best. I don't know if I'll be able to get the load back, but I'll track down the people who did it." Johnny nodded. "Do you need any more gear?" His slight pause made it clear that by gear, he meant weapons. "No, I have everything I need." Ken paused. "I'm pretty sure your driver and the other man are dead. I can't think of any reason they'd have been kept this long without contact, and I think we'd know if they showed up anywhere. I doubt your cargo is still there, but if I find it, I'll take a finder's fee." Johnny nodded. "That's fair enough. I feel sorry for Tony and his brothers. I have to make things right with his family. As right as I can. Nothing will make up for the loss of 3 boys." Ken just stood up and shook Johnny's hand solemnly and then walked out. Vic stared at his father, but before he could say anything, the old man breathed a sigh of relief and looked much older than his years. Still breathing. I know he won't take a job like this, but what if he had made up his mind? Looking at Vic, he continued, "If I have a heart attack or get hit by a truck or something, when this man shows up and asks you to pay him, you just pay. Capelli tried to cheat him. That's why the Capelli family moved back to Sicily. He can't be that cool." "Don't be a fool. If he wasn't, he'd be dead by now." Vic started to reply, but Johnny stopped him with a raised palm. "Don't argue. This isn't a game. This man? He's not bluffing or threatening. He's just doing what he does." Vic noticed the concern in his father's voice. "Why do they call him Silence?" "I've only heard rumors. They say he led a squad of trench raiders during the war. They would sneak through no man's land and kill enemy sentries and soldiers using garrots, knives, clubs, and axes. Prepare for more attacks. I don't know if it's true, but that's the story." Back to Rose and Lily. Rose unhooked herself from Lily as gently as possible and slid off the bed as she did every morning. She always told herself, and Lily, that it was because she wanted to give Lily a few minutes of extra sleep. But if she was being completely honest with herself, she admitted that with only one washcloth, she wanted to get herself cleaned up before Lily started frantically getting ready. She had just finished washing her face when she noticed in the mirror that Lily had propped herself up on her elbow and was watching her get ready. "Good morning, sunshine." "Good morning. Are you just going to lie in bed all day? Would you like me to bring your cart of books over here for you to work on?" "Oh, really? Mrs. Crenshaw will understand, of course. Only tell her that you have kept me awake all night, on account of your lustful and insatiable appetites. You have so worn out my poor, fragile soul that you can see a candle through it." Rose threw the puffball at Lily, hitting her in the shoulder, resulting in a gentle cloud. "Who kept who up all night? Tricky woman. You like it, and you know it. I want to. I really do. Still, you'd better get your poor, fragile soul out of bed and get ready. I don't think Mrs. Crenshaw would accept fatigue from excessive sapphic indulgence caused by overexposure to morally degrading material as a valid reason for being late." Lily giggled, rolling over onto her back and resting her chin in her palms, bright blue eyes glittering. "If that were true, I'd use that excuse every day." Rose rolled her eyes. Mrs. Crenshaw wouldn't consider the apocalypse a valid reason for being late. Lily dangled her legs off the bed and embarrassedly smoothed her thin white chiffon negligee. If we're lucky, we might end up back in the crypt with your man. They spent most of the morning traipsing around the crypt with Ken. He had brought several rolls of tracing paper with him and spent the morning drawing maps and then making notes on them in his notebooks, occasionally asking Rose or Lily to find one of the newspapers or books he was looking through. He diligently made notes on the maps with different colored pencils, then measured and made more notes. Besides the colored pencils, he had a compass and a ruler. Lily's curiosity took over. So, what are you doing? Ken finished drawing the red line. I don't have a name for it. I'm looking for connections between events and geologic formations for a client. Lily looked at the grid of lines. This pays well? Ken smiled, a little less wickedly than usual, it seemed. We can. It depends on the client. Rose sensed something wrong, afraid that Lily had said something hurtful, and started to pull her away, but Ken smiled genuinely. If Mrs. Crenshaw approves, I'd like to work until lunch. If you two don't mind, I'll have lunch delivered here for all of us. Lily had agreed for both of them. Sometimes Rose would get desperate at how much Lily appreciated food, and when Mrs. Crenshaw came down to check on them, Ken explained that he didn't want to be distracted from his business and offered his lunch, even offering to buy lunch for Mrs. Crenshaw. She hesitantly agreed, though she declined his offer to join them for lunch because she was afraid it might show favor to Rose and Lily. Ken wrote a note and gave her $2 and a note to give it to one of the cab drivers who was coming to the library to pick up visitors for lunch. He didn't ask what they wanted, but Rose figured $2 would buy some good sandwiches. Rose and Lily had cleared one of the research tables just in time. Mrs. Crenshaw had brought 2 large men with large baskets into the crypt, and they had prepared a feast. Rose watched as Lily's eyes almost popped out of her head at the sight of the trays of food. The smells were indescribably delicious. One of the men handed Mrs. Crenshaw a basket to take with her when she went upstairs. They were hardly sandwiches. Instead, there was a vast array of Italian dishes, some of which Rose had never seen before. One of the men pulled a bottle of wine and 3 glasses from a basket, deftly filled, and placed a glass in front of each of them. From Mr. Gambini, with thanks. Ken assumed a solemn look for a moment and replied, I appreciate that, and please tell him the food is up to his usual high standards. Rose froze and saw that Lily had frozen as well, holding a glass in one hand, eyes widened. That, in her opinion, explained the fine cuisine. Gambini's was the best restaurant in town. One dinner at Gambini's cost more than she and Lily made in a month combined. And while it couldn't help but be embarrassing, Gambini's was also known as one of the most powerful racketeers and bootleggers in town, and that meant Ken was connected to him. Lily caught her gaze and shrugged, then sipped her wine, closing her eyes for a moment. When the men left, they began their meal, and Ken watched in bewilderment as Lily devoured dish after dish, saying that each one was better than the last. Rose could barely keep up with her, but was surprised at how much she was eating. Each dish was indeed better than the last. Regardless, Ken didn't push his advantage, though he reacted to Lily's aggressive question with wry amusement. So, Johnny Gambini is one of your clients? Sometimes. I do research for him sometimes. He pays well, and I can always get a seat at his restaurant. Lily looked at him with narrowed eyes and smiled slightly. What does your wife think of your work? Rose was shocked at her tactlessness and kicked her under the table, causing her to yelp. Ken grinned. I'm afraid my job isn't too conducive to marriage. Oh, that's terribly unfortunate. Though it was quite obvious that Lily didn't regret it at all. Rose thought that was a fair enough warning for any girl. Despite being kicked, Lily continued to ask questions. Ken answered them with good humor and began to politely answer his own. Lily replied with a flirtatious glee that was too frank for Rose. Ken, however, deftly turned the conversation to another topic when it came to inappropriate situations, and drew Rose into jokes himself. By the end of the meal, as they were putting the dishes away in baskets for the men to pick up later, Rose realized that she had known Ken for ages. By the end of the day, as Ken got ready to leave, both she and Lily were saddened by his announcement that he would be gone for several weeks. 2 days later, Rose found herself working with a large, repulsive man with thin, unkempt hair, intense dark eyes in a lupine face, slouching shoulders, long arms, huge hands, and large, discolored yellow teeth that vaguely reminded her of shovels. Mrs. Crenshaw, evidently repelling him, introduced him as Mr. Pike. His leering glances made her uncomfortable, as did those of the frat boys and other men. The frat guys, and most men for that matter, clearly pictured her in a state of turmoil, but in this man's case, his desire wasn't like healthy carnal lust, it was far more impure. A vaguely acrid odor seemed to emanate from him. He asked to bring some books with German and Latin titles, but there were only a few on the list, and most of them were in the crypt. His excitement when he learned that he would have to fill out the paperwork was understandable. Rose patiently explained that without Mrs. Crenshaw's permission and keys, she could not even get into the depths of the crypt, but he only became enraged and ran out of the library in obvious anger, leaving his materials on the desk. Rose was hardly sorry to see him go, but still resented his angry departure and furtive, morbid glances. She took the books to Lily in the crypt and described the visitor as they sat squatting on Lily's cart. Lily wrinkled her nose. That sounds absolutely horrible. I hope I never meet him. Rose shuddered. Guys look at me all the time, but the way he did it? She faltered as she heard a metallic clanking sound outside the closed crypt. Rose got up from the cart and walked towards the sound, followed by Lily. Mrs. Crenshaw? No response, just the creak of metal. When they rounded the corner, the gate leading to the closed vaults was wide open. Lily squeezed past Rose with burning eyes. I swear, if there are any Kappa Sigma mugs in here again. She froze as the grotesque figure of Mr. Pike, clutching several volumes in his huge hands, emerged from the closed crypt through the open gate. A string of saliva dangled from the corner of his mouth, which was frozen in a hideous parody of a smile. He hissed at them, "Oh, what fine queens you'll make!" Rose was about to scream when several strong-clawed hands grabbed them both from behind and shoved rags of poisonous chemical into their faces. The last thing Rose saw as she lost consciousness were the yellow, shovel-shaped teeth that grinned in a triumphant grin. The old food truck struggled to move along the dusty road, the ruts occasionally tearing the steering wheel out of Ken's hands. Weeks of dry heat had turned the landscape a dull brown. Even the still green trees were muted and dull. His ragged undershirt and stained work pants were almost the same color as the dull brown fields. A tattered ivy cap sat firmly on his head, pulled down slightly to shield his eyes from the relentless sunlight. During the past 3 weeks, he had learned some interesting facts. The missing whiskey truck couldn't have traveled far. The pursuing car had reached the rendezvous point only 5 minutes later than expected, discovered the truck hadn't made it, and turned around, finding the dead bootlegger only 5 miles back. There really weren't any roads here, but the ground was mottled enough that tracks were unlikely even in open areas. Gambini was confident of the loyalty of his men, and Ken hadn't been able to find anything to indicate that he was wrong. True, there were some clues. His tattered vegetables, bought at Soulard's market, had attracted many wives to look at them and exchange gossip. The vegetables sold better than they should have, thanks to the drought affecting the local vegetable gardens and the fact that Ken was selling them below cost. Most of the stories were about a creepy hunchback who'd shown up a few months ago. No one really knew him, and no one knew where he was staying. But the stories said he lived somewhere near where the truck had gone missing. Ken was sure that the missing truck had never left these parts, and suspected that it was being held in one of the large caves he had found in the library on a geological survey. He drove the truck into a small forest that sheltered a small spring-fed pool by the side of the road, and took a few minutes to cover it with shrubbery. A closer look revealed no road in sight, and the small pool, despite the drought, retained enough thick greenery for good cover. He knew he would have to be careful. Gambini was right. At least one treasury agent was looking into the situation. A known bootlegger, dead with his throat ripped out, had attracted attention. The agent wasn't very sensitive, and all the housewives remembered the large blonde-haired man very well, and Ken tried to stay away from the agent's questioning. Apparently, the agent had left a couple of days ago, but Ken had heard that he had left his suitcase at one of the houses in the neighborhood. Ken pulled a long bundle and an old army backpack from the truck and began to move quickly but silently toward the nearest cave. Hello, dear viewer. As Rose walked around the library, sorting books and helping patrons, she found herself drawn into an unexpected and intriguing world. The dynamics between her and Lily, the enigmatic Ken Stanton, the mysterious contents of the locked shelves, all painted a picture of an environment rife with secrets and hidden agendas. At the center of it all was Ken Stanton, a man with a terrible past and connections to powerful figures like Johnny Gambini. His presence hinted at a deeper level of the library's work, beyond the chore of arranging books on the shelves. Rose couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ken than met the eye, and his sudden departure only added to the mystery. Meanwhile, encounters with unpleasant personalities like Mr. Pike contrasted sharply with the seemingly innocuous atmosphere of the library. His unsettling behavior and ominous words made Rose and Lily feel uneasy, hinting at dark forces lurking in the shadows. As the plot progresses, tension builds, secrets are revealed, and Rose and Lily follow a path full of danger and intrigue. With Ken's whereabouts unknown and the looming threat of Mr. Pike, all is set for an exciting continuation of their journey. Join me by subscribing and liking the next installment as we delve deeper into the mysteries of the library, uncovering secrets that could shake its very foundations. And remember, the full uncensored version is available on our Patreon, where the intrigue continues to unfold. Don't miss the next chapter of this gripping story.